Okay, so where I left off, we were talking about creative destruction. Now, I introduced you to this idea that entrepreneurship and technological innovation is both a creative force and a destructive force. In the short term, it causes unemployment and it causes the failures of established businesses. But in the long term, it creates entirely new industries, which put those slack resources back to work and helps to grow the economy in a process of never-ending evolution. Now, one thing that I failed to mention was that the economic elites do have an incentive to innovate themselves. Most R&D expenditure comes from the biggest companies, but that doesn't mean that they're happy to innovate. It's just that they're forced to. Research for these companies is like an arms race. If they don't do it, their rivals are still going to do it. And so there's still the risk that they might be made redundant. In addition, big companies tend to be less efficient at research as well. They spend the most money on it, but that doesn't mean that they get the biggest results. In general, it seems that there are very large diseconomies of scale in research. And bigger companies often suffer from worse work environments. They suffer from worse bureaucracies. They tend to be sluggish. They tend to be very conservative by nature. And I don't mean that in the political sense of conservative, but in the cultural sense. They don't like to change things. They're much more weighed down by politics. And this affects their ability to develop new products just as much as it affects their ability to do anything else. So big companies are able to compete with smaller companies only by throwing even more money at it. It's very wasteful, and as a rule, they're not going to be able to win. We can especially see this in the information age with Silicon Valley. Back in the day, research teams like Edison's Menlo Park were the kings at developing new appliances. But starting with the rise of Silicon Valley, which really dates all the way back to World War II, but really hit its stride in kind of like the 70s through 90s era, you get this brief period of time where you would have a huge company like IBM, the #1 computer manufacturers in town, and they would get unseated by a new competitor that's a couple of dudes working out of their dad's garage. You would get startups that consist of a few college kids in their dorm room, and they would be able to create more profitable products and steal market share from massive businesses that had the backing of the Department of Defense. Big companies do research, but they're not good at research. They're not efficient at research. And so this poses a massive problem for them. This arms race, this competition threatens to run them into the ground just as much as competition on price does. And just like price competition, what they're going to do is they're going to resort to collective action to try to protect their market share. Now, with a cartel, usually that's done through the voluntary action of everyone in the cartel. But when you talk about a cartel on innovation, that generally doesn't work. There's no real way that you can exclude or outcompete or predatory price a potential entrant. And the very fact that the entrant has to be an entrant means that you can't exclude them just by getting everybody who's currently in the industry on board. There's always the threat of someone from outside the cartel demanding a seat at the table. And so if private businesses, if economic elites want to control the pace of technological change, if they want to control the direction of it, the only recourse that they're going to have in the long term is through political lobbying. And this is where our story starts to link up with the political systems aspect of it. So far, we've been talking mostly economic theory, and now that public choice or political economy starts to show up. Now, you might ask, why would political elites want to help economic elites with this? Wouldn't the ruler of a country prefer to grow the economy so that they can have more to steal? And the answer is, well, in a democracy, that is what they like to do. But in a dictatorship or a monarchy or some other kind of authoritarian society where few people have power, that ruler, his interests are very often closely aligned with the interests of the economic elite. Because think back to C.G.P. Gray. The ruler is only ruler because he holds the keys to power. He's the ruler because he has the loyalty, which he buys through the treasure he raises and through the contracts for his business. He's the ruler because he does these things for his keys. Now, in a society that has many keys to power, in a democratic society, everyone is hurt at some point by creative destruction, just like everyone is hurt at some point by supply shocks or demand shocks or the business cycle. But most of the time, it helps us. Technological progress is the source of most of our growth. Most of our growth over the past 200 years, which is the vast majority of growth that humanity has ever had, has been Schumpeterian growth. And so in a democracy, well, firstly, remember how Gray explained that in democracy, you can't really pay off a bunch of individual groups. You have to pay off large groups of people. You have to pay off interest groups. And in a democracy, the easiest way you can do this is by creating a better environment for as many people as possible. If the ruler can grow the economy, and that both raises more tax revenues for him and also raises the post-tax income, the take-home pay of his supporters, then that ruler has a winning formula. And so we can predict that a democracy is going to tend to be very friendly to technological change. But the flip side of this is what happens when you have a very authoritarian government. You have few keys to power. These keys to power are by definition the most influential, the most resource-rich people in the country. They're the established elite, and they're the people that have the most to lose from technological change. Creative destruction is a threat to the ruler in such a society, and it's a threat in both ways. It's a threat on the destruction side because it threatens to destroy keys that he likely controls. And it's a threat on the creation side because even though it creates wealth, which is nice, it also creates new keys to power, which the ruler does not by default control. And this constant churn, the constant cycling of keys, creates more opportunities for a potential rival to step in and capture those keys, and in doing so, capture the government. In the same way that having more keys to power shortens the reign of a ruler, having a higher rate of replacement among the keys shortens the reign of the ruler. And so the more authoritarian the society is, the more we would predict that it would want to restrict technological change. The more it's going to prioritize social stability over economic growth. Now, do we have evidence for this? And the answer is yes. And for the remainder of this topic, We're going to be exploring this idea through the lens of different regions of the world. I don't hit every region of the world. Simply put, when I teach this in fall and spring, I don't have enough time to really go into detail with Europe and Africa. But we'll move around from continent to continent with a kind of story on each one that helps us to understand how the world came to look the way it does. And we're going to begin with one of the most striking examples of this very cynical take on politics at work with Asia. Asia, once the home of the world's greatest civilizations. Now, I told you way back at the start of the topic, if you lived in the ancient world, if you lived in the Middle Ages, even a short ways into the early modern world, arguably, if you went and asked someone, what is the greatest civilization on earth? They would tell you without hesitation, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Persia, so collectively one of the Middle Eastern civilizations, or China. Broadly speaking, what is now the Muslim world or China. That's where the wealth is. That's where the most powerful states are. That's where the most advanced science is, and that's where most of the innovations are coming from. Granted, that's mostly just because they have the most people. Technology is a public good, and so if you have more people working on it, you're going to have more inventions. If you were to ask someone in that era, what's going to be the most advanced civilization in several hundred years, they'd tell you the Middle East or China. It had always been that way. Even with the Roman Empire, Western Rome was backwards compared to Eastern Rome. The Romans themselves had a sort of inferiority complex intellectually with regards to Greeks. It had always been that way, and for as far as anyone could tell, it would always be that way. And yet, we see that around 1500 and then booming around 1750, Europe starts to take off. What happened? Well, the real story here is that something changed in Europe. But I want to show you through a few stories how Asia embodied that kind of anti-entrepreneurial spirit. Now let's think about why Asia and Europe might have developed so differently. Notice how on the Eurasian landmass, the East is a lot more compact, whereas the West is a lot more fractured. And this is not my personal theory. This comes from a book called Escape from Rome by Scheidel. Now, in Europe, you have a continent that is essentially one big peninsula carved up into a bunch of smaller peninsulas and islands, absolutely filled to the brim with thick, dense forest, filled to the brim with big rivers that form natural boundaries between peoples, like, say, the Rhine and the Oder, filled with thick mountain ranges, very, very steep, very rugged, very difficult to get through, like the Pyrenees and the Alps. Scandinavia is a giant mountain range. Scotland's a giant mountain range. Much of the Balkans is a giant mountain range. Now, Asia also has mountains everywhere, right? Pretty much this whole mass of land here that I'm shading in is a mountain range. But much of it is also more or less unpopulated, or the mountains are kind of shallower. They're not as hard to get around. They're more like the Rockies in the US. In general, Europe is full of choke points and defensive terrain. And this is going to make it extremely hard for anyone to build an empire. Now, the Romans managed to do it. But the secret is the Romans do it because they're fighting savages. Celts and Germans are savages. They're backwards. They don't have a modern state like the Romans do. They don't, the Germans are hunter gatherers. In general, they're very backwards people who are competent warriors, but who don't have the logistics of warfare down. And so it's going to get them ground down through attrition in the same manner that such people are all over the world. The Romans, you always hear people make this cliche comparison of the Romans to the Americans. It's very accurate. And the Roman expansion into Europe is kind of a bloodier and slower version of the American conquest of our frontier. So the Romans have a special advantage in that they're the first civilized people to make a serious bid to settle this land. Even so, they're not going to be able to hold it. They're not going to be able to hold it against each other in their many civil wars. And then when the barbarians come back in, having, developed a little more, they're not going to be able to retake it from the barbarians. And ever since then, nobody has ever made a long-lasting empire on the European continent. The map that I've been marking up comes from Escape from Rome. It colors in countries based on how much of their history from 500 to 1500 AD was spent in under the rule of an empire over 1 million square kilometers in size. That's just it's a little arbitrary, but they had to pick something, right? That's their cutoff for what's considered an empire. Why up to 1500? I assume that's probably so that like Spain doesn't get shaded in because of its colonial empire. But yeah, in this period that's leading up to kind of like the Renaissance and the colonial expansion of Europe, Europe is largely free of outside rule. It's very fractured. These fractured kingdoms are going to spend 100% of their effort fighting each other 24/7. I call it the Great European Mosh Pit. It's funny. Nowadays, unfortunately, some people have this habit of, because Europe is the peaceful part of the world today, they try to project this back into time like Europeans are more peaceful by nature, and that is complete nonsense. People in the past would have viewed Europe like people view the Middle East in the Middle East now. It's an incredibly bloody place. Now, you'll also notice two other zones. Well, really, there's one big zone, and there's a bit of a dividing line on it. You have this blob up here of kind of empire. That's Russia. Russia doesn't really emerge until the Middle Ages, but once it does, it's going to be a large classical Eurasian land empire. And then you've got the Middle East. You've got India, which is kind of unstable. India has this habit where it forms big empires and then they collapse and a new empire comes in. And you got China. And you have the various nomads like the Mongols who at times will unite, various parts of this into one big state. When you think of your Mongol empire, right, it's basically the whole thing. So why does this matter? Where am I going with this? Well, in Europe, they're at war with each other all the time. These different governments are locked in a permanent fight with each other over land, over resources, over religion. But they have such good defensive terrain that nobody is able to wipe anybody else off the map. France and Spain and different Italian principalities and Austria and the Prussians and the Russians and the Swedes and the English can duke it out all day long. But all of them they will survive. Unlike these big land empires where many different countries, many different peoples tend to keep coming under the rule of one big dominant monarchy. Now, very often people have this misconception of thinking of empires as good, and it's based on the reasonable conclusion that empires keep the peace and empires invest in infrastructure, and both of those things are conducive to economic growth. And that's true. But the downside is that if you have a country that's always fighting it out with its neighbors, that's a country where the ruler has to devote some resources to technological development so that they don't fall behind in the literal arms race. They have to devote resources to growing their tax base so that they can fund their wars. And they also have to get their own people on board with it. In an age before nationalism, people don't have any particular affiliation with the ruler just because he's one of them. At the end of the day, nobility are more alike than they are like to their own people. And so there's a very real risk that if the monarch doesn't play ball with his people, they will flip to a foreign invader. Now, in the earlier days of European history, this is mostly going to mean playing ball with the nobility. But over time, this becomes enlarged as the fiscal burdens of the state expand and as the bourgeois begins to develop. In time, it goes from being, we need to get the noblemen on board, so we're going to create things like parliaments, to we need to get the merchants on board. And so we're going to create a House of Commons. And then eventually it turns to, we need to get the proletariat on board. So we're going to give universal suffrage, and so on and so forth. World War I is going to be like the last straw that gets a lot of countries universal suffrage, and also women's suffrage too. Rulers had to bargain with their people because there was a credible outside option, and because there was a credible outside threat. In some sense, government was like a firm under competition. In Asia, on the other hand, it is completely different. Because these large Asian empires, they exist in terrain that's very open. They exist in more like grasslands and desert. They exist along extremely densely populated river valleys. That's the case especially in Egypt, Mesopotamia, India with the Indus and the Ganges, China with the Huanghe and the Yangtze. They're far more concentrated, and that makes it a lot easier for a warlord to conquer the whole thing and then to project power outwards. And so the natural tendency is that you get this sort of lone superpower politics where there's one big empire that's so big that it keeps the peace in its own neighborhood. Nobody can really threaten it. But the empire is, one, very unstable by nature. It's very overextended, huge diseconomies of scale in its bureaucracy. And two, there is no outside option anymore. And so this means that your ruler is both going to have less desire to bargain with their people and at the same time have a greater fear of the people. And so the ruler is naturally going to favor a far more authoritarian structure. And this is indeed what Asia develops. And it's been that way from day one. In the days of ancient Greece and Persia, the 300 at Thermopylae, the Greek historians wrote of how the Persians lived under what they called Oriental despotism. In contrast to the Greeks, who actually had democratic assemblies and who, even in their tyrannical city-states, still often had some concept of civil rights. In a typical Middle Eastern regime, you would just have an absolute monarch. In Asia, it's even more despotic. Now, granted, Asia did have some upsides. In particular, the Chinese are actually the first major civilization to develop the concept of a meritocracy for their bureaucracy. But we've already seen bureaucracies aren't good at running economies. But this is how Asia develops politically. In Europe, there's a lot more cooperation between people, even if it's cooperation between the lords and the ruler. In Asia, it's way more top down from day one. And as a consequence, Asia will actually end up technologically regressing in many important aspects.